Florida didn't wait. Before Lincoln even took office, before the first cannon was fired at Fort Sumter, this swampy, sparsely populated state became the third to leave the Union. What made Florida jump first into the fire? Pride? Fear? Or something far darker beneath the cotton and gold? The newspaper office sat at the edge of Adams Street, where the pine boards creaked like they were whispering bad news. Most days, the printing press sang its iron thong through the heat and dust. But on this particular morning, November 7th, 1860, the machine stood silent. The men inside weren't waiting for ink. They were waiting for Lincoln. Thomas Wren leaned over a stack of early editions, his spectacles dangling from his fingers. He wasn't a rich man, but he knew which names carried weight. His job wasn't to report truth. It was to hold a mirror to power and hope it didn't shatter. A boy burst through the doorway, breathless. "The wires just came in from Macon. Lincoln's won. It's done." The room went quiet. Outside, the sky held no thunder, but something had broken all the same. By nightfall, the city was simmering. Gas lamps flickered in every tavern, flames dancing off brass buttons and whiskey glasses. In the governor's mansion, silence. In the streets, rumors. Thomas watched it all with ink-stained fingers in the eyes of a man who had seen hope crushed under headlines before. The Tallahassee Sentinel published a special edition. The lead article wasn't written by Wren, but by a local judge. A fiery essay titled, "Florida Must Not Wait." Men read it aloud in front of the Capitol as if reading scripture. Florida was the young state, barely 15 years tethered to the Union, but its ambition was older. A tangled mess of cotton wealth, frontier pride, and enslaved labor. Wren knew what lay beneath the gilded halls of the planters' mansions: debt, fear, and the weight of a system built on the backs of men who could not speak their own names in court. He saw it in the editorials that arrived anonymously, threatening Northern sympathizers. He saw it in the men who spat at free black merchants and day Braylight. He saw it in the way church sermons, once about salvation, now stirred crowds with talk of vengeance. At night, Wren walked past the jailhouse. There was a boy inside, 16, black, shackled for inciting mischief. All he'd done was ask what Lincoln's election meant for men like him. Thomas looked away. He told himself he was only a printer, not a prophet, not a savior, just a man who set the type. But that didn't keep the guilt from following him home like a shadow. The weeks blurred. By December, militias were drilling in the field just beyond the city. Towns held Union funerals where coffins were buried under stars and straps flags. In Quincy, a fire broke out at the train depot. Some said it was sabotage. Others whispered about rebellion. Plantation owners started locking up their books and shipping their sons north, not to learn, but to buy guns. And still, the editorials came. Florida must rise. The South must stand. A nation of our own. But in the printing room, Wren saw the other letters too. Ones no one published. One's written in shaky hands. I have 3 sons. I fought in Mexico. I have no wish to fight again. I own no slaves. Why must I die for those who do? This is madness. But who will say so out loud? He never printed those. One morning in late December, a rider galloped into town from Pensacola. He carried a scrap of paper and a face pale with fear. Federal troops were fortifying the harbor. War wasn't coming. It had already unpacked its bags. That night, Thomas stood outside his office, watching clouds roll over the Capitol dome. He lit a cigarette he couldn't afford and whispered to himself, "They will tear this place apart to save it." And he was right. A week later, the Florida legislature called a convention to decide the state's fate. The planners were already packing their bags for Montgomery. The newspapers, including Wren's, printed in bold type, "The hour approaches, freedom or subjugation." But no one asked whose freedom, and no one dared to say that it wasn't subjugation they feared, it was equality. Wren watched as young men lined up to join militias in boots too big and hats too stiff. He watched as ministers blessed cannons. He watched as a boy, no older than 12, carved a Confederate star into the courthouse wall before anyone had even drawn up a flag. He returned to his printing press, and as he cranked the handle and smelled the hot iron and ink, he imagined the pages stacking up, not as news, but as obituaries. For the Union, for reason, for all the things that held. Part 2. Behind Closed Doors. Inside Florida's secession convention. The halls of the Capitol didn't echo like they used to. Elias Finch stood outside the double oak doors of the House chamber, holding a leather-bound ledger and a cracked inkwell. The January wind clawed through the hallway windows, but inside the room was thick with heat, not from the hearth, but from the voices of men who'd already decided what they wanted history to remember. Elias wasn't a lawmaker. He was just a clerk, a listener, a watcher, but even he could tell something irreversible was about to happen. That morning, the delegates arrived in polished boots and tailored coats, 69 men, mostly planters and lawyers, flanked by secretaries, porters, and newspaper men. They shook hands like brothers and spoke like kings. Outside, the streets were packed. Farmers, merchants, enslaved porters holding horses as still as stone, women on porches holding babies wrapped in rags, everyone waiting for a decision already made. Inside the chamber, the air turned sour fast. Some men thumped the Constitution on their desks. Others cited Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi, already gone. Florida, they said, must not be left behind. One delegate stood and called the Union a northern yoke forged by abolitionist tyranny. Another said, "We're not seceding, we're reclaiming what was always ours." Laughter followed that, but not from Elias. He sat near the back of the room, scribbling minutes with shaking fingers, not because he was afraid of war, not yet, but because something sacred was being twisted. He remembered his father, the Coeur cattle rancher who voted Whig
and kept his rifle polished, not loaded. A man who never owned a slave, but always paid his debts. He used to say, "This land don't run on cotton, boy. It runs on blood and borrowed time." He wondered what his father would say now. The first vote was a formality to open the floor for a secession ordinance. The ayes won, nearly unanimous. Then came the speeches, hours of them. Some men argued Florida was defending her rights. Others raged about Lincoln as if he'd marched an army straight through Tallahassee. There was even a prayer for Jefferson Davis, though he hadn't been named president of anything yet. And through it all, Elias watched one man, Senator Abram Carter, a lion of Leon County, 30 years in office, 600 acres, 81 slaves. Carter didn't speak until dusk. When he did, the room stilled. "Gentlemen," he said, voice deep and slow, "if you fear war, good. It means you understand the weight of what we do. But if you fear freedom, then you already know the cost of keeping others in chains." Heads turned. Was it dissent? A warning? He paused. "But we are past fearing. Florida must leave the Union, not because she hates it, but because it no longer recognizes her as its own." Thunderous applause. A few men stood. Elias felt something cold settle in his ribs. The final vote came after nightfall. 62 for secession, 7 against. No amendments, no delay. The ordinance was written, signed, and sealed in a matter of minutes. One delegate wept, not from sorrow, but joy. Another shouted, "Let the stars fall! Florida will rise!" But Elias couldn't cheer. He looked down at the ink on the page. He'd written the whole thing in his own hand. Later, alone in the hallway, Elias watched men file out into the freezing air. Some sang, some clutched their coats like armor. One leaned against a column and vomited. He followed Senator Carter outside. They stood together under the gas lamp. "Sir," Elias said, voice brittle, "do you think this will save us?" Carter looked out toward the dark horizon. "No," he said quietly, "but I think it will prove we're willing to be damned on our own terms." Then he walked away. The next day, Tallahassee was unrecognizable. A flag with a single red star flapped from the Capitol dome. Church bells rang, though it wasn't Sunday. The Sentinel published a full-page headline, "Florida is free!" But Elias didn't see freedom. He saw boys polishing muskets, families packing wagons, slaves with wary eyes. And in the rotunda of the Capitol, he watched a janitor remove the portrait of George Washington from the wall. He asked why. The man just shrugged. He wouldn't want to see this. The sky over Tallahassee was colorless that morning, neither gray nor blue, just blank. Governor Madison Stark Perry stood at the window of his study, watching breath rise from a horse's nostrils in the courtyard below. His cravat was loose, his coat lay discarded across the chair. The fireplace crackled, but the room still felt cold. He had known this moment would come. He just never imagined how heavy it would feel once it arrived. For 4 years, Perry had served as Florida's 8th governor. Born in South Carolina, raised on land and law, he was a man of conviction, sometimes louder than reason, but rarely without purpose. He had warned the legislature months ago, prepare the militia, secure the forts. Florida must not be caught unready if the Union dissolves. Some called him paranoid, others prophetic. Now they called him commander-in-chief of a breakaway republic. Behind him, on the desk, lay the final draft of the Ordinance of Secession, carried from the Capitol not 30 minutes earlier. Fresh signatures, still damp ink. The document declared Florida a sovereign and independent nation. Perry was to affix the executive seal. He hadn't yet. A knock. Colonel Joseph Finnegan entered, Perry's political ally and future Confederate general. He bowed his head slightly, then set a rolled-up map on the table. It showed the coastline, every federal fort, depot, and harbor under question. "The men await orders, Governor. We can take Fort Marion by nightfall. Barrancos may take longer." Perry didn't turn from the window. "How many do we have?" 1,000 ready, another 1,000 by week's end." "And how many do they have in Washington?" He hesitated. "Enough to come looking if they wanted to." Perry gave a dry smile. "They will." Down in the city, bells tolled again. Children waved scraps of cloth painted with stars. A new flag had been stitched overnight. White field, red bars, a lone star in the corner. Tallahassee was celebrating, but the mansion was still. Perry returned to the desk. He picked up the ordinance, reading the words not as a politician, but as a man. Each sentence bold, final, sharp as a bayonet. He thought of what he was defending: Florida's honor, its autonomy, the Southern way of life. But he also thought of the thousands enslaved, whose names never entered the ledgers, but whose labor filled the coffers of every man who signed that ordinance. He thought of his wife, Sally, who once said, "It is not wrong to love the land, but what grows on it should never cost a soul." A wind whistled through the shutters. He sealed the document, and with the press of the state's crest, he made it law. Hours later, the legislature reconvened in the Capitol rotunda. The crowd outside was swelling, their voices rising like hymnal at a funeral. When Perry entered, the applause was thunder. But he didn't smile. He climbed the steps, stood behind the podium, and looked not at the delegates, but at the gallery above, where common citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide, fists clenched. Then he spoke. "It is not with joy that I stand before you," he began, voice even but strained. "It is with the solemn weight of duty. We have not broken the Union. The Union, by denying us equality, has broken itself." He paused. Some nodded, some merely waited. "Let us be clear. This is not just a political act. It is a commitment to defend our homes, our rights, and yes, our Southern way of life. We will not be the first to fire, but if fire comes, we will not run." Silence, then applause. But as it echoed, Perry's eyes lingered at the back of the room, where a black man, one of the Capitol's attendants, was standing holding a tray of water. The man's eyes met the governor's, and in that flicker of shared recognition, something passed between them. Not understanding, not agreement, just the bitter knowledge that they would not fight the same war. That night, Governor Perry walked the Capitol grounds alone. A courier had delivered news from Montgomery. Other states would soon follow. A Confederate Congress was forming. A new flag would be sown. But Perry didn't look to the south. He looked north, towards Washington. He knew Lincoln had not yet been inaugurated, knew there was still a flicker of time, a chance, however slim, that this storm could be turned away. But deep down, he knew better. And so it was that on January 10th, 1861, Florida stepped into the dark. Not pushed, but led. Led by men who believed they were saving something sacred, even as they buried it